one of the most common arguments that I hear online when I start talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, and Jesus is that there is no historical evidence to prove that Jesus was connected to the Essenes. There's nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Essenes. And so you guys have a lot to say about that. So let's dive in. I would love to hear from you. What do we know historically about the Dead Sea Scroll group and their philosophy and way of life? And let's start with that, then we'll move into Jesus.
Hold my beer, Melissa. I mentioned to you before we started, I'm literally turning in a research paper on this tomorrow for my master's thesis. So this topic is very ripe in my brain at the moment. And it's just a topic I just absolutely love studying because once you start going down the scholarly rabbit hole of the amazing connections of the Jesus movement in the first century to the Essene type of Judaism, the connections just really never stop revealing themselves. And James and I have seen this in the last couple of years of our kind of obsessive research in the subject. And I think you mentioned people say, oh, there's no connection between Jesus and the Essenes. I think the first reason people say that primarily is probably because they don't want it to be true for religious reasons or otherwise. And we've encountered this a lot. We've literally debated this topic before with Wes Huff and others. And so what we try to show people is that, first of all, before we can answer this question, we need to know, what do we mean Essenes? What is that group? What are we talking about? Because a lot of people think we're just talking about the Qumran group, as you mentioned, Melissa. And that's the first fallacy to clear up, right? Is that the Essenes were not the group known as the Qumran group or the Dead Sea Scroll group. That was one Essene group of many, many Essene groups. In the first century, Essenism was a type of Judaism. And even Josephus tells us this in Antiquities, I believe. He says there were basically four main sects of Judaism: Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots or Sicarii, and the Essenes. Now, just right here, Melissa, let's do some process of elimination. Was Jesus a Pharisee? Is there good evidence for that?
Nope, definitely not.
Definitely not, right? What about Sadducees? Any matches there? No?
Nope.
The temple cult. He was a member of the temple cult.
Yeah, it doesn't line up super well with the historical Jesus. So then let's go to the Zealots. Now, most people are less familiar with the Zealots. They were a very militaristic group of anti-establishment Jews who believed that it was their job to fulfill the scriptures by overthrowing Rome. And so I think the Hebrew word Sicarii means like the bladed ones. And they had performed many famous assassinations, such as the high priest Jonathan, son of Ananias, in the, I think, 60s AD or something like that. They would sheathe blades in their cloaks, like small little daggers, and they would go around and slit people's throats like priestly establishment people that they wanted to get rid of. And so they were very difficult to deal with, and they actually are primarily the group that kicked off the whole revolt against Rome that led to the destruction of the temple. So does that sound like a group Jesus would have been involved with to you?
I'm guessing not, since he said turn the other cheek.
Yeah, I think that's a good guess. And so we're left with one group, right? Now, of course, it's a bit of an oversimplification. It's not that every single Jew in the first century was only one of these four types. There would have been blends, and it was a spectrum. Some people sided with these beliefs and those beliefs and whatever. But suffice to say, of these four buckets, there's only one that is even possible that Jesus could have belonged to. So to me, that's a pretty good piece of evidence right there when you look at the historical context, as we just did. But then you look at the Essene type of Judaism's beliefs and practices. And now this is what scholars really look at. It's a segment of scholarship called historical phylogeny, which is the study of relationships between groups and sects, right? So scholars don't just look at the name of a group to know if it was related or any of the more obvious things. They look at the sectarian beliefs and practices to know like what groups branched off from other groups, like Gnosticism, for example, is famous for this. There was like over 60 different branches of Gnosticism by the 4th century. But all the trees of Gnosticism branch back to the single original sort of founder of Marcion or Marcionism, and it bifurcated from there, right? Same with virtually every sect of Judaism. So Essenism was an anti-temple, anti-Pharisaic sort of reform movement of Judaism that started probably sometime after the Babylonian exile in the 5th century BCE. And it was because these Jewish people believed that the lying pen of the scribes had falsified the Torah, as Jeremiah said in chapter 8, verse 8, that the priestly cult, the temple cult, had introduced paganism into the holy temple of God, which, per Jeremiah 7:21, God never commanded sacrifices when he brought us out of Egypt through Moses. And whether it's Epiphanius, I believe even Philo and Josephus, so many early church fathers say that the Essene type of Jews believed ardently that Moses never commanded these abominable sacrifices, that this was basically Satanism being practiced in the temple. And over, they appealed to the law of Moses as being the 10 Commandments. And so they believed that the Torah was corrupted. And this is another scandalous thing of why, especially Christians, don't want Jesus to have anything to do with Essene-type Judaism, because they were very vocal about the fact that the Torah was corrupted. It's even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Damascus document especially, they talk about the wicked priests and the lying pens and all these kind of themes that have corrupted God's commandments with man-made rituals and laws that God did not ordain. Damascus documents full of these statements. And so Jesus clearly shows these Essene-type beliefs when he's opposing the temple cult, when he's correcting the scriptures. You've heard it was said in Leviticus, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I say to you, no, a new commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Turn the other cheek. I mean, this would have been super scandalous for a first century rabbi to be correcting Old Testament passages and saying, you search the scriptures for you think in them you have life. So this is an Essene type of belief without question. There's no other sect of Judaism that believed the Torah was corrupted in the first century other than Essenism. And then you add in anti-animal sacrifice. There is no other Jewish sect other than the Essenes that believed that sacrifices were not something God commanded. And we know Jesus cleanses the temple, pronounces condemnation. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So Jesus shares that commonality. And then we have vegetarianism, which we've been over a bunch. We have voluntary poverty and communal living. There is no other Jewish sect in history that has this practice of living together in communion, sharing all your possessions, other than the Jesus movement of the Jerusalem church, as seen in Acts 2 and 4, and the Essene type of Judaism. And then we have atonement baptism, yet another striking commonality between the Essenes and the Jesus movement. All Jewish sects performed some kind of ritual immersion in water and purification. But the big difference is the Essenes were doing this as an alternative to animal sacrifice. So instead of slaughtering animals to have their sins forgiven, they believed God wanted us to bathe in the waters of purification, as it says in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and repent and perform this kind of water immersion ritual to be cleansed from your sins. And you would return from the water cleansed from your sins, as in the community rule in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So who do we see practicing this kind of repentance and baptism for the remission of sins? Melissa, any guesses?
Jesus, John the Baptist.
Yes, Jesus and John the Baptist. And the funny thing is about John the Baptist is that he's also another striking link between Jesus and the Essenes, because even Christian scholars, for crying out loud, will admit, yeah, John the Baptist was probably an Essene. He checks every box of Essenism, right? He's this ascetic guy living out in the wilderness, eating carob pods and honey, and he's pronouncing the way of the Lord, preparing the way of the Lord in the wilderness. And Jesus says, this is the one whom the prophet Isaiah said would be preparing the way of the Lord in the wilderness. And what happens when you crack open the Dead Sea Scrolls and you read what they believe they were fulfilling? It says, we are the ones crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. The same self-designation that Jesus gives John the Baptist was what the Essenes gave themselves. We are the ones crying out in the wilderness. I mean, literally in the Transjordan wilderness in Qumran. And so John the Baptist is sharing that self-designation. So John the Baptist is point for point an Essene, and he is literally pictured as Jesus's mentor. And Jesus was his protege, basically, carrying on the movement after him. And so in the Gospel of John, you see this intentional downplaying of John the Baptist, and Luke actually, because we don't want Jesus to have had a mentor, and especially not an Essene mentor, because that means he was anti-sacrifice, anti-blood atonement, and all the things that are inconvenient for Catholic theology. So all this stuff has been obfuscated over history. And so when you ask a Christian if Jesus was connected to the Essenes, they'll laugh in your face and say there's no history or proof of that. But scholars know otherwise. And in fact, this is really an emerging niche of scholarship right now, thanks to people like Dr. James Tabor and Dr. Robert Eisenman, who are like, hey guys, we got to take a look at all these parallels. And just those 5 that I showed you, again, are so important because they are not shared with any other Jewish sect in history. And as far as historical phylogeny goes and scholarship goes, that's what we call a slam dunk, my friends.
Aaron, it's even more of a slam dunk than that because there's two additional traits that, for me, just knock this entire case out of the park. There was only one Jewish sect that rejected participation in warfare. They refused to fight in wars and they refused
That's
to make
true.
weapons. Pliny and Josephus both speak about this. The early Christians were well known for being pacifists. They would let people kill them instead of fighting back. That's how hardcore of pacifists they were. So, I mean, does Jesus sound like he would reject warfare and making weapons? The second one is an absolute rejection of the practice of slavery. Every single other Jewish sect, there was widespread practice of slavery, especially with the Sadducees and Pharisees. I mean, it's all over the Old Testament, the practice of slavery, regulations for slavery. And again, the Essenes said, guys, God is not giving you regulations for how hard to beat your slave and how many sex slaves to take. God, that's not God's cup of tea, guys. Let's be honest. And we know the early Christians outright abhorred the practice of slavery. It was an anathema to everything that they believed about the love and wisdom of God. So we have these 7 things together. It is an absolute slam dunk, in my opinion, that philosophically, the early Christian movement descended from this type of Judaism.
Thank you so much for watching. As a way to show my gratitude, I am continuing to offer my one-on-one sessions almost 75% off what they were. I personally love offering the lower prices, and you guys do too, because you've been booking up my sessions and supporting me, which I so much appreciate. My spots are limited to 6 sessions per week, and they fill up extremely fast. So don't wait, book your spot today. You can sign up for a 25-minute energy healing, a 45-minute energy healing and spiritual coaching session, or you can pick a custom session and we can fit the session to meet your needs. We can just talk. Some people just want to talk about deconstruction because they don't have anybody else to talk to. I am here for it. I love meeting you guys face to face and getting to spend some time with you, and I am here to serve you. Book your session here. Now back to the show. There is another text that has Jesus talking about a vegetarian diet, which I would love to ask you about, and those are the Essene Gospels of Peace, which I've been studying recently and just been blown away by what, like, the absolute beautiful, jaw-droppingly beautiful passages that are in those texts. But I would love to hear, because again, there's a lot of arguments about them not being necessarily from the 1st century or maybe being a forgery, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I know there's more research coming out now that you don't necessarily have all the answers to yet, but you've been teaching, you both have been talking about these texts for a while, and I'd love to hear your personal perspective on why you value them, and then maybe we can get into the philosophy after that.
In fact, I can give the historicity aspect part of it, and then I can pitch to James for the philosophical, if that works.
Perfect.
I read a book by a woman, Elizabeth MacDonald, who wrote a book called The Lost Jesus Scroll, where she talks about in the 1980s listening to Vatican radio. She was a Catholic at the time and, confessing Catholic and all that. And on the Catholic radio one day, one of the monsignors starts reading, they would sometimes read scrolls they had in the Vatican library, because as we know, these people keep every ancient text on earth secret to themselves and they won't let them out, but they'll sometimes say, hey, we have these cool texts, we'll read them on the radio for you. And there was this one text, I think they just called it the Gospel of the Essenes. And this Catholic monsignor is reading it on the radio, and this woman's listening, and she's like amazed and blown away. And she is so intrigued to know more about it, she writes a letter to the Vatican, I think to the Pope at the time, and says, can you please release a copy of this to me? Can I see this document? I want to read it. And they said, no, sorry, no documents can ever leave the Vatican. It's kind of the rule. And this was also what Edmond Bordeaux-Szekely said, who was the one who wrote the Essene Gospel of Peace in his translations from Hebrew into English. He said that, and his story is really cool, but he gets this job at 19 years old after graduating high school, working for the Vatican Archive record keeper at the time. I forget his name, but he names the guy, and he was really, really close with him. And he says that Edmond Bordeaux was very passionate about St. Francis of Assisi, as was his cardinal. And so they would talk about St. Francis all the time. And he was like, I want to know what inspired St. Francis. Where did he get his inspiration from? And so he says, well, take this key to the archives and just go dig around and see what you can find on it, because I'm sure there's tons of texts in there that you can find answers to. And so he does, and he's digging around and reading all kinds of cool stuff. And then eventually he finds this Hebrew Aramaic text. And he was proficient in 4 different languages, by the way: English, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew and Aramaic. And he's reading it and he's going, wow, this is remarkable. And he takes it out and shows it to his Monsignor. And he's like, wow, you found something incredible here. And he says, can I translate this into English? And he says, of course, but you can't take this manuscript out of the archive. So you can never give this to a scholar or somebody to review it. All manuscripts stay in the Vatican archives, period. That's the rule, no exceptions. He said, okay, just let me translate it. So Edmond Bordeaux translates it, and it's what we have now as the Essene Gospel of Peace. And so it's really interesting because although we don't have any manuscript evidence, one scholar named Dr. Robert Eisenman has been doing research and studying this gospel, and there's actually a lot of internal evidence that it is a very ancient text. And of course, it's an English rendering of a Hebrew text, but as somebody who studies biblical Hebrew, when I read it, I also saw a lot of interesting Semitic sort of sounding phrases all throughout it, especially the use of nominal clauses is very common in Hebrew. The combining of nouns, pronomical suffixes, and things like this. You can see how Hebrew likes to combine nouns rather than the way English does it, such as the word of the Lord in Hebrew instead of the Lord's word. And you see things like that, and like, man, this reads like a Hebrew text translated into English, but I'm no expert in Hebrew or anything. But Eisenman seems to think similarly, and he says he's found some pretty convincing evidence to show that this is probably a first century text. But the last piece of scholarship I'll talk about is that the Essene Gospel portrays the Essenes as communing with the angels, something called angelology. And this is like what kind of like Hindus believe, that all the different deities, they don't worship them as exclusive singular gods. They see them as aspects or archetypes of the one universal God, right? So the Essenes similarly saw the angels as archetypes of the one God. So they have the 7 branches of the Heavenly Father on the tree of life, and the 7 roots of the earthly mother on the tree of life. And so where the masculine and feminine roots and branches meet form the 7 chakras. And so they worshiped, and what I mean worship, I mean commune. They communed with the angel of water, air, earth, and sunlight, the 4 elements. And we have an attestation from a church father named Hippolytus talking about an Essene sect called the El-Cushites. The El-Cushites, the Cush or El-Cush is like another word for the Garden of Eden, right? So we have the Edenic ideal in their name, El-Cushites. They were the ones trying to establish or return to Cush, the Garden of Eden, as it was in the beginning. And they practiced the exact same type of angelology, according to Hippolytus, as is written in the Essene Gospel of Peace. They would commune with these angels and say certain prayers and incantations to them, like the ones given in the Essene Gospel. They would bathe ritually in water to commune with the angel of water. And he lists a number of things, which we've done an episode on the Jesus Way podcast, where you're like, this is point for point what we see in the Essene Gospel of Peace. So we know for certain that there was an ancient Essene group that did practice basically exactly what we see in the Essene Gospel of Peace. So that's dead accurate. We know that this has to be a real document if a Catholic Monsignor read it, which I've researched, by the way. I looked up the guy that the woman wrote about in the book, and sure enough, he was on the Vatican radio during those years. And so everything is checking out, even to the point that Edmond Bordeaux's cardinal, who he got the key from, he was alive for the next 30 years after Edmond Bordeaux published the Essene Gospel of Peace, and he told his story over and over again of how he got this gospel, right? And if it was all a lie, why wouldn't his Monsignor say, hey, wait a minute, everything Edmond Bordeaux is saying is not true. I never gave him a key. He never got a manuscript from me. And he never said anything. And in fact, interestingly, the Catholic Church waited to denounce it until after he died, his Monsignor who gave him the key to the archives. Interesting, right? Maybe they didn't want their propaganda being obfuscated by this guy who would have said, no, that's true. I did give him the key and he did find a manuscript. So there's a lot of pieces of evidence that are leading in this direction and converging in the direction that this probably is some kind of ancient text. But to know for sure, we would need to see, obviously, a copy of a manuscript.
Right. Well, I'm holding out hope that that will come to light at some point.
As are we, Melissa.
James, do you have anything to add?
Thanks for that historical background, Aaron. The both of us have just been profoundly inspired by this book. The spiritual philosophy outlined is just so beautiful, and it had to have been written by a true spiritual genius. It's so
Yeah.
beautiful, and it changed our life. So I don't even care if it's, a forgery or its lineage doesn't go all the way back, because it's inspired me so much. And I truly
Yeah.
believe for someone to write words that are that inspiring, you have to be tapped in to something deeper. However, it does completely echo everything we know about the Essenes, the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, and the Elkosites, what their spiritual philosophy was of prioritizing peace, of utter commitment to nonviolence, to communing with the angels of the various elements, especially water and the air, the breath. And also, what resonated with me the most on my own personal journey is the absolute prioritization of the health and purity of the physical vessel. And we know this was extremely important to the first Christians. And from my own life path, this is what I've seen. I used to be very overweight and unhealthy. I dealt with different addiction issues. I've been through it all. And I know what my level of consciousness was like when I was 100 pounds overweight, eating a ton of meat, drinking alcohol, all of these things. And one of the main tenets of the Essene Gospel of Peace is that riotous living and living in sin, basically, I don't know how else to say it. It fills you with parasites, and parasites are essentially antennas for demons. It's almost like the Wi-Fi signal that negative beings connect to.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And there's some really interesting documentaries on YouTube about the demon parasite connection. It's almost like the parasites, which are extremely common, are the physical representation of a metaphysical being. And when you have these parasites or demons, your consciousness is very distorted. It makes it very difficult to connect with God. You'll have literally intrusive thoughts that are self-deprecating and tell you you're a piece of crap. You'll never amount to anything. You'll also have thoughts on the other side that are very prideful or lustful, whatever. So Aaron and I have just come to see this entire path as a path of spiritual warfare. And the focus on physical health and mental health is really to protect oneself from negatively polarized beings that are seeking to suck more beings into this service to self outlook. So, Aaron, you're welcome to illuminate more of this, but the health of the physical body, eating healthy, drinking pure water, getting sunlight, grounding, this is everything we promote with the Jesus Way. It's also what we promote with my business, Organic Muscle. I have a plant-based supplement company, if y'all want to check that out. But we've just seen personally, and with many others, that it is absolutely part of the spiritual path to be healthy and to be fit and to have a clean diet, because otherwise you're just giving an opening to forces that make you fat, sick, tired, unconfident. I mean, can you really be of service in the world when you're totally drained of energy and you don't have any confidence to go out there and speak about these principles?
Yeah, link to Organic Muscle will be in the description. And I just wanted to comment on what you just said, because it's just amazing to me. Before I even discovered the Essene Gospels of Peace, I had discovered like the quantum health circadian biology movement online, and just transformed my spiritual connection just by getting outside, grounding to the earth, which would be the angel of earth, getting under the sun, which would be the angel of light, getting in the cold rivers, which would be angel of water, and then of course meditation and breath work for the angel of air. And just like it instantly like just transforms your entire energy field, and it's like you can feel this information coming to you from nature, and you can feel that it's like the spiritual connection. Nature is not just physical. It's so spiritual and it's so conscious and it's so intelligent. And add to that getting meat out of the diet. It's a complete transformation. And actually, there was a passage that I found. Just give me a minute because I'm going to look it up.
In the Essene Gospel,
Yes.
there's so many bangers in there,
Mm.
man.
Okay, so the passage is from book 2, and Jesus gives you the prescription for physical health. I'm just going to read it here. It says, "Blessed is the child of light who is strong in body, for he shall have oneness with the earth. You shall celebrate a daily feast with all the gifts of the angel of earth, the golden wheat and corn, the purple grapes of autumn, the ripe fruits of the trees, the amber honey of the bees." So you have the vegetarian diet there. "Then you shall seek the fresh air of the forest and of the fields, and there in the midst of them shall you find the angel of air. Put off your shoes and clothing, and suffer the angel of air to embrace all of your body. Then shall you breathe long and deeply, that the angel of air may be brought within you. Enter into the cool and flowing river, and suffer the angel of water to embrace all your body. Cast yourself wholly into his enfolding arms. And as often as you move the air with your breath, move with your body the water also. You shall seek the angel of sun and enter into that embrace which purifies with holy flames. And all these things are of the holy law of the earthly mother, she who gave you birth. He who has found peace with the body has built a holy temple, wherein may dwell forever the Spirit of God." So everything that we were just saying,
Beautiful.
communion with the earth and the angels of the earth and the vegetarian diet allows the presence of God, the divine union within. This is a clip from an 1.5 hour long interview that I did with Aaron Abke and James Nethko, hosts of the Jesus Way podcast, on the historical evidence that Jesus was an Essene, that Jesus was a vegetarian, and what the historical gospel and message of Jesus actually was. Check the description for the link to the full interview.